joined in this session Bryan Osterkamp, who is Principal Architect in charge of the testing infrastructure at USAA. And Bryan's been a speaker at our live events in the past, and it's great to welcome him to the Digital Forum. Partly because he's a great speaker, but also partly because USAA is recognized as, certainly among the US insurance industry, the leader in terms of digital transformation and the services, the online services it offers its customers. So, Bryan, I'm just going to introduce you briefly here and let you talk a little bit more about your role and dive straight into your presentation, which is about managing transformation, how you've managed transformation at USAA over the past couple of years, and how you're, in particular, benchmarking the progress you're making in managing compliance and compliance risk at USAA. Thank you, Bryan.
Yeah, so again, thanks, Matthew, and thank you for QA Financial Digital Forum for having me here. I'm excited to talk to you guys about what we're doing in the world of compliance and kind of how we're embedding automated regulatory compliance into our software development lifecycle. So before I get too far into the talk, I wanted to share a little bit about who and what USAA is. So as Matthew mentioned, we are a financial services company. I'm primarily going to be talking about the banking side today, but we have banking, auto insurance, and other aspects of that as well. And when you look at our mission statement and our USAA standard, what I want to call out is it says, be authentic and build trust. And so what that means for us is we want to be authentic and build trust with not only our members, but also our regulators, our internal compliance team, et cetera. And when you look at our systems that we have within USAA, we have proprietary closed systems, we have containerized modern systems, we have cloud, et cetera. And so when you start thinking about how do you embed regulatory compliance into the SDLC, it's not just building into one tool and then automatically that means that we're covered. And so I wanted to walk through a little bit of the journey that we've been on. So as Matthew mentioned, I'm Bryan Osterkamp. I am the Principal Technical Architect over the application testing infrastructure. And what that really means is I have oversight into the technologies that we use for automated testing, for manual testing, as well as supporting the process around testing in general. So I support the banking side, the insurance side, and really all of the areas. So really from an enterprise perspective, how do we look at that from that perspective? I've been at USAA for about 17 years. For the last 5 years, I've been the testing infrastructure architect. Before that, I was an architect in the bank as an application architect over credit card area, the auto lending area, over the mortgage area at various times. And so very familiar with the regulatory landscape, the compliance landscape, the changing landscape of compliance. But before I get too far into this, I wanted to start off with my own personal compliance story. As many of you probably experienced, my family, whenever COVID-19 hit, I had the situation where my kids who were going to school and going and having their teachers, if you will, overseeing their work, validating what they were doing, making sure they were doing, learning what they needed to do, to my wife and myself overseeing the works, essentially kind of being the regulators or the compliance workers for what, trying to validate that our kids were doing what was needed. And so what happened with us was, whereas before my kids would have a full day of schoolwork, and then they come home and maybe they might come online and play some video games. What would happen after this happened, when we started doing online schooling, I noticed my kids started finishing classes about 11 o'clock or noon. And so we had much rest of the day where they were playing games and gaming after school. And so what we started to figure out was, my wife and I were saying, we really need to start tracking and understanding what amount of time our kids are playing video games. So we tried a few different ways of doing this. First was, hey, let's just watch the clock and make sure the kids don't spend more than, say, a couple hours of video games. But then the next thing would happen was, maybe we would peek our head out the window or the door and look in there and kind of write down on a sticky note and say, you know, we really want to make sure that the kids are doing what they should be doing. So let's write this down, and okay, they've been on an hour, and then we could kind of track it from that perspective. Or, you know, worst case scenario, we would say, hey, how much time did you spend playing video games today? And of course, their answer was usually, not long enough, or maybe a few minutes, but not too long. But in actuality, it seemed like they were really spending, you know, hours upon hours at a time. And so we were having a really hard time knowing and understanding how much schooling or how much gaming they were doing online. And so we were really struggling with that. But then we started thinking, hey, we're both technologists. Why don't we use technology to help us ensure compliance, if you will, with our kids, and making sure that they do the gaming not too much. So then what started happening was we moved from spreadsheets and clocks and other things like that to let's actually use the technology. And thankfully, a lot of those systems already had this ability. So what we said was, let's start setting limits or thresholds technologically so that we don't have to do all the manual work ourselves and keep track of it, and quite frankly, just get frustrated by that. So we decided, let's start saying, maybe on the weekdays, we'll give them 2 hours at a time or for the day. And then maybe on the weekends, we'll give them a little bit more time because, you know, it's the weekend, let them relax a little bit. And by the way, we probably don't want them to be playing video games at 4 a.m. So let's make sure from 7 a.m. say to 7:30 is when they're allowed to play. So we use technology to set those limits and those thresholds. And then we also would confirm that with a dashboard. And so while we had the limits on the front end, we could also say, hey, just in case something went wrong with the limits or we configured it wrong, let's validate and make sure that they're spending the right amount of time. So then you'll see here where we have a dashboard that says, okay, on you know, Saturday they played 2 hours and 15 minutes. That's okay. Wednesday they played 3 hours. That doesn't really sound right. Maybe we set our thresholds wrong. So we have that backup to validate and the dashboards to make sure that they were doing what we expected. So that's our own compliance story, and I think it kind of fits well into the journey that we've been having as USAA from you know, doing a lot of manual compliance to automation. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about that. But before I go into compliance, I wanted to maybe explain a little bit more what compliance is. So I like the second definition on the left-hand side, which is in 1B, which is conformity in fulfilling official requirements. So for us, that's essentially was we were standing up or using IT general controls in support of the FFIEC. If you're not familiar with FFIEC, that's essentially kind of an interagency collaboration across several regulators within USAA. It's the Federal Financial Institution Examination Council, and they have what's called a Dev and Acquisition Handbook that dictates certain things, such as, you know, what code reviews are required, test planning, test result reporting, security vulnerabilities, etc. And so that's kind of what this use case is about. And a way to simplify, if that sounds kind of complicated, is whether it's, again, within your institution or at home, it's really doing what you're told to do and being able to prove that. So the bottom line up front is we don't want to demonstrate compliance via manual tasks. We want to really do it via automation. And before I get too far into what we did as an organization, I wanted to kind of walk through. Some of this is probably a little more obvious, but I want to kind of get a good baseline. So if you're focusing on manual compliance, typically you're going to have low startup costs because you essentially will throw bodies at it, try to get, you know, work done from a manual perspective. But that also means you're going to have endless hours of work where you're trying to, you know, have lots of people collaborating, making sure that they're pointing and clicking and validating spreadsheets and reports, etc. And so you're also going to have oftentimes complicated spreadsheets. And then you may also have potential for miskeying or errors of the data because it's a human being that's doing it, and all of us are fallible, so we may make mistakes. When you look on the perspective of automated compliance, what you'll see is there may be a little bit more startup time. Oftentimes your compliance is that what you're doing when you're doing automation, you're typically starting from manual compliance, and so you're Does take some time to make sure you have all of those processes and everything fed into that. But when you start automating things, it's going to take some time to build out that automation. What we've also seen, though, is also much more enduring. So if something happens, you need to change a rule and you need to rerun those rules, you don't have to have a whole bunch of people doing all of that validation. You just run it through the engine. And what I'm going to focus on today is really the last three, which is it allows you to build dashboards for the individual. So it's not just this one spreadsheet that has this large amount of macros that tie together, and hopefully in the end it all works. You can build dashboards for each individual. The second thing that I think is important is it's technology agnostic. So I love Milan's talk where he talked about, tying everything into maybe your Jenkins pipeline, for instance. But one of the challenges that we have as an institution that's kind of grown over time is we don't just have one type of pipeline. We have pipeline, again, maybe for the cloud, for our internal mainframe systems, for our distributed systems. We have a couple different pipelines, technologies we use. And so by doing it in the way that I'm going to be talking about, it's going to be technology agnostic. So you don't have to necessarily tie it into those individual pieces. Now, what he says is still absolutely valid, but the control testing piece of it is what's important that we're going to be focusing on. And then the last thing is you can use it beyond compliance. So let's not just say that this information is important for compliance or for regulators, but it's also important maybe for me as the application owner to know, am I doing proper testing, et cetera, or an executive may want to see that as well. So when you look at the problem statement that we had at USAA that we were trying to focus on, it was really, we had a lot of manual work, a lot of people that were doing the work to try to ensure compliance. There may be different interpretations of what that means. It could, again, be a little bit challenging as far as making sure that all the data is put in properly. And then we also saw a lot of one-off systems managing control tests. So maybe the bank might build something for their solution, but then another area may build something else. And so it was really hard to have a central control test results location. So that's where we started off in our journey and really started seeing the need to really start automating these components. So I wanted to walk through a little bit about what we were doing, kind of how we got there. So the first thing to look at is, for instance, accessibility testing, which is something that's near and dear to my heart. If you think about accessibility testing, I like this example because you can't automate all accessibility testing, and you definitely don't want to do it all manually. So there's already, even in this instance, 2 different locations that you might be storing those test results that you need to evidence for your application. So you would report both the automated results as well as manual results. We will put that into a test results system of record, if you will, and then we push all of that data down into the data warehouse. So here's a way that we're already pulling it into one location, so that it doesn't matter how many locations it's coming from. But if you take another step back and you look at automated accessibility testing, manual accessibility testing, but then you add in functional testing, security testing, static code analysis, those are all things that we need to evidence or show to make sure that we are doing testing properly. So then you, again, feed all of those test results into one test results system, and then all that goes down into the data warehouse. And one thing I've talked about in the past at the QA forum was concept of a testing freeway, but and that helps in this as well. So a way to think about it, that is, we try not to be opinionated on the tools that teams use. So for instance, we may have a team using a test framework called Selenium, which is Java-based, for instance, WebDriver.io, which is JavaScript or Cypress. So there's all sorts of different tools teams might want to use. And if we dictated or mandated, you have to use this quote one framework, that doesn't give a lot of opportunity for our teams to experiment and to make sure that, they're using the tools that make the most sense. So the way that we can still evidence compliance is making sure that they still pass their test results into our test results system of record and then flow it down the data warehouse because they're passing in the test results system of record and we already have it in there. Then we as an infrastructure team can pass those results back down into the test data warehouse or to the data warehouse. And so again, it's technology agnostic, it's framework agnostic. It'll allow us to have that freedom for the teams, but also ensure we have compliance. If you take one more step back beyond just the test results area, because obviously for showing our IT general controls, we need to have more than just test results. We need to show code approvals, we need to show application vulnerabilities, etc. What we do is we pass all of that data down into that one location. So then I'll show you in a little bit how all of that will fit together. So then that goes into data warehouse. So I've showed you a lot of boxes and arrows, and that can be a little bit maybe confusing. But so what I wanted to do, because it's summertime, and maybe some of you guys, wish you were at a water park. So we'll use an example of a water park. So if you think about a slide, at the very top, what you'll see is you have a few different entry points, right? So on the left-hand side, it talks about application vulnerabilities, for instance. On the right-hand side is application to support team mappings, as in what teams support which application. And then you'll see in the middle, test results, code approvals, accessibility findings. So all of those have different entry points. So you can think about different lines, basically where people go in, but all of the data flows into this one location. So when you think about that, maybe you might have an example where on the left-hand side, you see maybe it's a modern system. And so I have a Kafka queue that I want to pull that data from. And so the source system is a Kafka queue, but then it all flows down into the data mart, right? On the right-hand side, again, in our instance, we have a lot of legacy systems. So then you'll see where the files maybe are coming through there, and then test results, maybe that's an API. But all of the data, again, flows into one location, regardless of where it came from. So you could have containerized systems that are reporting this, you could have mainframe, et cetera, and all of those are gonna flow into that one location. So that's a kind of a good example or a way to think about when you're trying to understand how the data might flow. This is an example of what you can look at. So now I'm going to go a little bit deeper into back to these boxes again and show how each one of these pieces fits together. So what you'll see again on the left-hand side is all of the various source systems that we're pulling the data from, but again, it's going to be technology agnostic. So like I mentioned before, we have our own closed systems, we have cloud, we have containerized systems. So if we try to tie all of the rules into these one system, that's gonna have some potential for issue. Now, there may still be some rules in those, but to actually evidence it and do the control tests for it, we need to ensure that we have it in one centralized location. So another example that you might see is down a little bit lower, you'll see where it says code approvals. So again, same thing for our code approval system. Say we have something for the mainframe, but then we have a different code approval system for a distributed tier. If we built the controls and the control tests in each one of those, that really requires us to keep track of all the different systems that we're running in. We have to write the rules, we probably have to duplicate the rules, etc., because we're doing it specifically in the system. But when you abstract it out, which is number 2, and you push the data to one location, that allows you to not have to build all those control tests in those various systems. You just throw it into that data warehouse. And so this is where we have an IT data mart that supports this. So when you look on top of the data warehouse, the next thing that happens is you'll see that we have control rules. So a way to think about this is like a simple rules engine that you might have. And all it would be doing, for instance, like a code approval would be, I want to validate that I have 2 code reviewers that review this request. And if the 2 reviewers, if there's only 1 reviewer on it, then I know that I failed the control test. So the control itself is maybe in, for instance, GitLab CI, where I validate that there's 2 merge approvals, but maybe a developer accidentally made it where it only requires 1 approval. Well, the rules engine itself, which is separate from the system that has the control in it, can validate that to make sure that that's actually happened. So for the instance of if we don't have 2 code reviewers, what's going to happen is you'll see on where it says number 4, notifying the outliers. And so what happens here is whoever the stakeholders are that are defined are going to get a notification, hey, for this merge request, we realized that you only had 1 reviewer, you need to fix this, or you need to make sure that your processes upstream take this into account. Same thing, maybe it says, hey, you're supposed to have security tests because according to FFIEC, if you have a new application or a major change, you have to have that and it's missing. So the notifying outliers or the automated notification piece is important to make sure that we can flow back in and get that feedback. So this could be something via email, Slack, text, etc. Those could all be configured based on the control, based on the control owner, etc. And then what you'll see on the right-hand side is where it's actually giving a compliance dashboard and reporting the results. So again, we can show this to our regulators, it can show it to our audit, but another thing beyond compliance is you can show this to your executives, to your application owners, etc., because this is just as important to them as well. So an example dashboard that you might see, this is obviously very simplified. We would have something much more complex, but maybe you want to see, well, this is the control that it's tied to. So this is the requirement that we have, again, maybe from FFIEC or another regulator, which is I need to have 2 different code reviewers. And so then I can see the total sample size. One thing that I think is something to consider as well is, do you take a sample size or do you take the whole population? If you take the whole population, it's going to give you a much better understanding of where you're at instead of kind of waiting quarterly, which is what oftentimes is what's usually mandated. So we try to be a little bit more consistent or more continuous in that. And so then you'll see that, for instance, in this case, we were at 8,500 in compliance and then 1,500 out of compliance. And so then you'll see the next one is for evidencing accessibility testing, for instance. Maybe we're only at 50% compliance. And then on the bottom, you'll see that maybe we're 95% compliance with evidencing defect closure. So that's a simple dashboard. And then you'll see as well as threshold status can say, you know, the threshold should be 80%. We're kind of close to 80%. So let's say this is a warn. You know, we made it yellow so that you can make sure you see that. But again, making sure that we're not just doing things based on color, because you may have someone that's colorblind. You want to make sure that the threshold status column also says warn, so that way you're not just indicating it, you know, via color, which someone may not necessarily be able to recognize the difference. But then for this evidencing accessibility testing, this is a fail. So maybe we want to notify not only just the individuals that failed this, but maybe there's a control owner that also needs to know this because they might want to build out their controls or modify or do some research. So again, this is just a simple dashboard that you could have. You could also maybe have dashboards that do trending over time, for instance, and then you can see how well your controls are kind of hitting the mark. So let's kind of bring it all together. This is, again, kind of back to the summer theme, the water park theme. Kind of a easy way to remember this is, you know, number one is going to be separating the data from the rules. So again, the rules are not going to be, for the control test isn't going to be within each one of these slides, but it's going to be really going down to that one location, which is in the data mart. And then when you look at, so number three is going to be kind of the rules engine. So on the bottom left, you'll see a lifeguard that's kind of looking out, expanding the horizon. That's your rules engine. That's make sure that we're kind of intact. And then on the bottom right, you'll see notifications that are saying, hey, if there's something that's out of whack that the rules engine tells me, again, via Slack or email or some other text, we want to make sure that we have that covered. And then you'll see on the top left that there's a kind of a bullhorn that represents the dashboards. So again, that's going to be something that could be used by your regulators, but also is really beneficial for an executive or an application owner that actually owns that application to make sure that they're covering it. And then also could also be for someone that owns the control test to make sure that those controls that they built out are supporting the need. So just a reminder, automated compliance, you know, we want to make sure that we're evidencing compliance. And, you know, in our case, we have various different customers that we want to focus on, or consumers, such as, again, those executives, compliance, et cetera. So we really don't want to do things manually. Sometimes it, you know, seems easier and maybe it's a little bit easier to get started. So if you need to do that, that's okay. But let's make sure that, you know, we're looking a little bit further beyond that. So, you know, in summary, no macros, no manual entry, and you'll have no misunderstandings. When you look at the actual architecture and how you might build it out, again, this is kind of a good one slider to remind you. We want to separate the data from the rules when you run those control tests, because likely you have several different systems that are doing those controls. And so if you build it into the system itself, then it's kind of like asking your kid if they ate too much ice cream, right? They're probably going to say no. but if you had a grandparent, maybe someone else that could say no, they have had too much ice cream, right? That's an example of making sure you separate those concerns, and then make sure you push that data to one location as the source of truth, and then you build a control rules against that data with in our case, it's a simple rules engine that validates whether or not these rules were make sure that there's compliance in those. Those could be managed by a development team. You could also build a simple rules engine UI on top of that, where the control owners themselves are the ones that write those rules. It really just depends on what the skill level of your control test owners would have. It's also important for that feedback, just like in Agile, you have feedback for to make sure something's not going well. It's the same type of thing in this case where you have automated notification. Again, you can do that based on the control. You can do it based on the application owner or the consumer so that they get it in the channel of their preference. And then making sure that we're building out reports that are individualized, that are really based on what the individual user is. So in our case, because it's in the data mart, there's several different technologies you can use to build dashboards or other reports. And so you could build them, maybe from an enterprise perspective, but what I've seen as well is maybe each area wants to build their own dashboards because they're interested in different sets of data. Because it's all in one location, it allows you to do that. Whereas if it's in several locations, it's a little bit harder to manage how all those tie together. So thank you very much. Appreciate your time.
Thank you, Brian. Great to hear you present online from home, and we love the domestic analogies, especially to do with screen time. I think we've all seen the issues there. Great dashboard there. We've got a question from we've got a couple of questions now. They're coming in, so we've got a couple of minutes. Here's a good one from George. Can you share some recent instances of how USAA has seen efficiencies when internal or external auditors demanded evidence of traceability, et cetera, et cetera? Just real life examples of when your team had to respond to this external requirement.
Sure. So one of the examples that we had in the past was for my own domain with test reporting. What we used to have was we would have in the past, again, spreadsheets that were used to say, here's the test results, et cetera. Because we started moving to a centralized test result reporting solution, not based on technology, but really based on just whether it's automated or manual, waterfall, agile, et cetera, having all the results in that one system. We were able to again, same type of thing, regardless of the technology, we could go to that one system that we had built out to actually show, here's the test results and the reports that were given. And because it was used across the enterprise, it didn't require us to have individual knowledge of each system. We could just say, here's the results of our testing. And then that was much easier to have that conversation. We also tie, for instance, our stories to our test cases. And so that allowed us to show the traceability. What we're working on now is also saying, here's how the test case is also tied to, again, those regulations or those laws, et cetera, so you have full traceability from end to end.
Okay, and I had a related question actually, which is you've spoken a lot about the accessibility testing and how that's a key focus for you right now. And we know that the Americans with Disabilities Act requires that companies, not just financial firms, but all companies treat their websites as public places, which requires a lot of testing in terms of accessibility. But there's also a commercial opportunity there because 20%, I think, of Americans have some sort of disability. So if you can do a better job serving that marketplace, you win more market share. And I just wondered, you've talked about your processes, but what about the benchmarks for the ROI and the investments you've been making? Is that changing at USAA in terms of dashboards and reporting?
Yeah, so one of the focuses that I have, again, in the testing space is trying to provide more ability to our development teams to be able to do their own testing. And so what we've done is we focus a lot more doing, for instance, accessibility testing in the pipeline, so that we're able to make sure we catch those things early on. And one thing, Matthew, I think that you said that I would probably say a little bit differently would be also, you know, when you build something to be accessible to everybody and to be inclusive, you're actually building it to be a better product for all, not just, you know, a certain community. And so I think that's one thing that the conversations that I'm personally having with a lot of our leadership is, let's understand the perspective of this actually builds a better process overall for everybody. Yes, it absolutely helps our users that have disabilities, but in general, for instance, an example might be that I like to use is maybe, for instance, like sliders on mobile devices are really hard to use,
Yep.
you know, regardless of what you're, you know, able to do. But an example to make something more accessible might be maybe instead of using a slider, which not all people can do, maybe you type in the answer instead of having to use a slider. Because sometimes it's like, well, I want to try to get 75, but it keeps going to 74 or 76. And so if you can type it in, that allows both, you know, really anybody that's using the tool or application to have a better time of it.
Well, Bryan, thank you so much for joining us.